Hello and welcome to Driven by Doing podcast. Today we have Samira Khan joining us from California. Samira Khan is a social impact innovator currently working at Salesforce. Samira, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Venki. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's begin your story and your background, Samira. So tell us where you are from and how your story has begun.
Absolutely, Venki. So I'll just start from the beginning. I was born in the Midwest outside of Chicago. My mom came to India from India for her higher education to the US, and then my father came from Pakistan. They met here, and so I'm American, spent most of my life in America. Along the way, I did work and live internationally, which really changed my perspective on the world. I think I became much more aware of far off communities and some of the challenges that they face that were very different from my own life. So, from a very young age, my parents would take me back to India and Pakistan. And I saw a lot of dire poverty there and some combination of just being oriented toward relationships and people and stories and very connected with the world around me. And those experiences led to my wanting to give back. So for a very long time, as early as I can recall, I've been involved in types of community service. So whether it's a soup kitchen at school or it's engaging with a local religious institution that I go to, etc., I was always oriented toward answering the question, how can I help somebody else in my life? So I think that's always been a central part of who I am. And then also from a very young age, I've loved creative writing. So writing people's stories and really connecting and getting to know people. And so both sort of on the how can I help other people as well as on the stories and narrative side, the focal point is really the other individual. So putting somebody else at the center. So that's kind of how I've constructed my life since the very beginning. I moved around a lot as a child. So, although I was born outside of Chicago, we moved to the UK. I lived in California, different parts of California. I also lived in Pakistan for 2 years for high school, which was a very transformative experience, very different cultural experience. So, I've been exposed to a lot of different cultures, even from a schooling perspective along the way. Eventually landed back in California at Stanford, and I studied something called management science and engineering. So it's an engineering degree in that you take the underlying core with others, but then you get an opportunity to specialize. And that's when I got interested in this intersection of technology and policy and technology and culture in the world, which is where I work today. But I didn't quite know, since it was so long ago, where that education would lead me. The technology sector was certainly ever present, but the social impact sector wasn't as robust, wasn't as vibrant as it is today. It was very much siloed. So nonprofits were doing their work, governments were doing their work, corporations were doing their work. There were some public and private partnerships, but the bridges weren't as they are today. And it wasn't this cross sector dialogue. And I think young people back then were less aware of also these opportunities in the social impact space. So after I went to Stanford, I was like, what is the closest degree or opportunity I can get to having an impact on the ground? So I thought policy was a good lens from which I could have an impact through, let's say, government or an intergovernmental. Went to the Kennedy School at Harvard for 2 years. And then I had a really hard time without any work experience getting jobs that I really liked in the social sector. So I was being started at the lowest rung of the ladder, like research associate, program associate. However, when consulting firms would come and interview at the Kennedy School, I was getting invited for a lot of those interviews. And I think it's because of my engineering background. So I actually did something that I didn't know I would like. And I signed on to Accenture, and that sort of kicked a path kicked me off on this path of strategy consulting. And at Accenture, I was working specifically on the social sector. I was in a very small public service strategy practice based out of DC. But before that, I will say, because I was so oriented toward the individual and giving back, I spent a year in Bangladesh. So I deferred my Accenture offer, spent a year in Bangladesh working with acid violence survivors. So women who had been burnt with acid, who needed, legal assistance. They had been shut out from their families and their communities. So I really immersed myself with them. I volunteered every day, tried to write their stories, and really fell in love with that grassroots work. But for career reasons and developing a career path, had to come back to the US and started at Accenture. From Accenture, went to a few boutique consulting firms, went to A.T. Kearney, helped kind of kick off a social impact practice there in partnership with a partner, and then worked for a social enterprise and eventually landed at Salesforce. But I'll pause there because yeah, I mean, I can certainly tell you more about Salesforce, but there's a lot packed in there already.
Thanks a lot for giving that background, Samira. I think a lot of diverse experience at that very early on, I think shaped some of the career, even like, what you kind of chose, right? So tell us a little bit more about how that initial exposure, whether it's like, living in Pakistan or India, kind of like really shaped your career as well.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and one that I don't often think about deliberately or intentionally. But I know that I was very curious as a child, and I liked, as I mentioned, writing stories and narratives. So whenever we would go to a new place, whether it was, Lahore or Faisalabad, which is less of a big city, but it's still a city, or a rural area, I would want to speak to people and understand their stories. So therefore my language skills improved significantly. I was very interested in culture. And I think from the very beginning, I started developing this repertoire or this toolkit of being able to have conversations with many different kinds of people from different cultures and different walks of life. And I was really absorbing all of these experiences. And I think then what struck me later is just from a justice perspective, the inequality that exists in the world. There is huge income inequality. It is shocking to me that there are people at the highest sort of echelons of society who have billions and billions, while there are people who go hungry, who cannot pay for their children's education. So in Pakistan, I saw girls my age working to earn money in order to go to, let's say, middle school. So I was seeing things that were very different from my life. And that just from the very beginning struck me, because fundamentally, human beings are the same in so many ways. They connect in the same ways. You can form friendships with somebody from any walk of life if you try. And so, why is it that they have to live such a different life because our system is structured in a particular way? Fast forward many years later, it very much ties to my work today, because I think about leading a purpose driven life. I think about, how do we create a sustainable future for all? What role do private businesses have to play in thinking about purpose and driving social change? Because fundamentally, whether we can measure it or not, we all should believe that we want to close this gap, this inequality gap that exists, because it's fundamentally sort of against a person's rights for them to be living in such poverty. There has to be a minimum threshold. And in this sort of discussion, I've just focused on poverty, but there's a host of other, inequities as you think about access to healthcare, access to education. And all of those just fundamentally strike me as um, wrong. And that one day we're going to wake up and realize that, we're just shocked that we created a society with so much inequality. And I think closing some of those inequality gaps actually does lie in greater commitments from corporations and governments in terms of resource allocation. So, fast forward to my job at Salesforce.org, one of the things I'm very focused on is, how do corporations and private businesses, among other entities, identify their social impact priorities or make commitments to the sustainable development goals? And then how do they move resources or reallocate resources better so that they are actually trying to solve some of the most difficult issues that society faces for some of the most marginalized populations across the world? Very long winded answer, but I hope that was helpful.
Absolutely. And you talked about a lot of different aspects there, Samira. You talked about like how government, organizations should all come together in order to connect those dots, because it's not just one person or one organization can do it all. So I think you started working, connecting all these dots, especially from your background, from your experience working as a consultant. like having that engineering background. So do you think like all these different aspects kind of like helped you to connect all these together to be able to like really paint that picture? Because you talked about purpose driven life, and sometimes when I think about it, I think a lot of times we see a lot of problems around us, and sometimes we feel like, hey, like no, there might be a better solution for this, whether it is healthcare, education, social problems, and sometimes we just don't take action, right? We feel like, hey, like no, that's not my problem, because like no, I have everything that I wanted to live a comfortable life. But we are starting to see that change, especially in the last 2 or 3 decades,
Mhm.
especially with how the technology has evolved. Now, a lot of people who might not have the access before were able to gain access because a lot of organizations are working with technology partners. And Salesforce.org is one of those partners that a lot of nonprofits, a lot of sales nonprofit organizations across the world work with closely. So tell us a little bit more about what is that role the technology has played or is going to even play more in the coming years to be able to bridge those some of those gaps.
Yeah, happy to speak to the technology piece, Venki. And you raised a lot of great points in sort of setting that up. So definitely cross sector, there has to be a conversation around social impact and purpose. These different entities must come together. The challenge lies in that they often have different incentives, and so they're coming at the problem from different angles, but being able to map all that and leverage the strengths that different sectors bring is very important to what we call systems change, or a holistic solution to challenges around education and climate change and whatnot, and also helps sort of drive the resource allocation. You also mentioned, connecting the dots in my diverse experiences. I wouldn't have necessarily have been able to predict where all these different things I've done would land. They have been, though, extremely useful, but it wasn't planned and deliberate. So I think sort of coming from a quantitative mindset, being able to think about business value or social impact in a business driven way, being able to think about purpose in a business driven way is extremely helpful. Understanding how technology works is extremely helpful. That global experience has been extremely helpful. In terms of technology itself, I think technology is definitely a blessing in that it allows impact to scale. So if you have a solution that is providing sort of greater educational access to a particular population, technology has the ability to scale given there's hardware available, there's broadband available, etc. So it goes hand in hand with this notion, though, that you must build the infrastructure alongside the technology, and you must innovate not just in terms of technology, but in how the infrastructure is built and the business models around how you bring players together to build this infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean anything from awareness and education of the issues. So to shift individuals' mindsets so that they care to lead, like you said, a purpose led life, so that they care to give resources toward helping others, to education and skills, like what does it take to implement and operate on impact goals. So to actually policy and policy changes and design principles. So basically you need that whole layer of infrastructure that I think helps technology scale and reach some of the most marginalized communities. I think technology has the ability to leapfrog some of these inequalities. But if we don't create the infrastructure, if we're not conscious of diversity and inclusion, if we're equity and inclusion, if we're not conscious of some of these sort of harder to reach populations and how we can bring them along, they will forever get left behind. So there's also that risk because technology is developing and moving so quickly, and it's such an advantage in the world. That's why I like to think about technology access is almost like a human right. Like the way we think about universal basic income, I think some level of access to technology must be thought of in that way because it is becoming essential and fundamental to daily life. And as far as like purpose led, I'll just say one quick thing about that as well, lives. For me, it's how one makes decisions. So it goes back to mindset shift. It's not just work, it's not just charity and philanthropy periodically. It's every decision you make, what you eat, what you wear, what you buy, how you talk to people. So being well-rounded and holistic in a social impact education, I think is important to create the change makers of the future. So that's why I invest a lot of time in learning about the youth and also connecting with them, because I think they are going to carry this torch, for lack of better words, forward and create a sustainable future for all.
That's an amazing answer, Samira Khan. I think it just it's so motivating for me to see other social entrepreneurs like you to be able to like think the way that you have been just answering these questions, like just having that big picture view and working closely with these underprivileged communities or people who are in need of help. Like that's what you love doing every day, and you kind of had that purpose right from very early days, and now slowly moving into the corporations, right? What do you think companies can do in order to, especially with technology, now that we just spoke about technology, what can organizations do in order to make it even take it to the next step, like the social innovation in the society?
Yeah, I think that better bridges need to be built between corporations and social entrepreneurs and innovators. People on the ground not only are closer to sort of community interests and needs, which we all know, they're also extremely innovative. You'd be shocked at the kinds of risks they take to bring a bold idea to life that will impact their own community in their own backyard. So much innovation taking place there, risk, resilience, spiritual courage. And corporations should better learn to leverage that and work with these entrepreneurs. For example, corporations have large networks, they have access to a lot of intellectual property. How do we make that more open and available to organizations on the ground? How do we co innovate with them to create new solutions and then scale them? Corporations can help scale due to the assets that they have and the people, the financial capital, basically bringing all of their assets and resources to bear to help these organizations scale or these businesses scale. Businesses also, I think, can influence the culture internal to a large corporation in helping them think about these problems on the ground as real problems, as human problems, in sort of sharing their stories, also sharing their sort of methods and approaches with regards to the community. And how do you best reach the community to create market share? So I think there's this symbiotic relationship and bridge that absolutely must be strengthened. And I think there's a long way to go in terms of corporations learning from organizations on the ground. So you'll see a lot of executives at top companies speak about sustainable development goals and purpose. And we at Salesforce talk about using business as a platform for change. And it is really quite powerful and beautiful because they are bringing businesses in their ecosystem along, and they are inspiring their employees and giving their employees the freedom, the space, the platform to incorporate impact into their day-to-day work and to dedicate resources and time to that. So that is extremely powerful. And you'll see designers applying an accessibility lens. You'll see particular people such as myself thinking about social entrepreneurs in very far off geographies that I haven't even been to, etc. So I'm seeing a lot of sort of cultural change due to executive messaging that's very powerful. But at the same rate, there needs to be a stronger conversation and pathway between the executive and the change maker, because the change maker is on the ground creating movements in their very own communities to drive impact. And they are trying to change the way their communities live here and now. And I feel there's this gap there. So how do we create this pathway? I think is the sort of next phase of all of this work. And we need to build that pathway to increase empathy and human understanding so that we're all driving toward the same goal with the same momentum, so that technology is not just for those who can afford it and not just for rich countries and communities.
Absolutely. And you talked about what salesforce.org is actually working towards by helping all these organizations. So, what are some of the resources that you have seen, like a lot of these organizations across the world taking advantage that salesforce.org provides to be able to like better serve their own communities with technology?
Absolutely. So, in general, with corporations, I've seen a trend of trying to bring all of their assets to bear on the social sector or these challenges. For example, financial capital in the form of grants or impact investments, technology in the form of adjustments to serve particular sectors or communities, intellectual property related to that, encouraging their employees to give back, to volunteer, to donate their time on solving particular challenges is another way. So there's various forms of capital, some financial, some human, some sort of around intellectual property, some in kind, some in terms of how their relationships play out and how they work with their supply chains and who they bring into the ecosystem and who they don't. There's also a skill building element with corporations sharing their learnings externally. So there's so many assets that corporations have to bring to bear. And in the prior days, people were just thinking about it in terms of financial capital. Then it became volunteerism. Now it's how do we bring the full power of our business to bear on a social impact challenge or our purpose. And Salesforce as a company has done just that. They are really thinking about the power of the platform and using business as a platform for change with impact as sort of a North Star with commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals. Salesforce.org in particular is the tech for social good portfolio of Salesforce. So it's really focused on technology for social good, technology, tech for good and change. And so we have three main cloud products: Nonprofit Cloud, which serves nonprofits globally. We're offering that for free up to a certain number of licenses and at a discounted rate to really get that technology into the hands of more organizations, even if they can't necessarily afford it. Second, Education Cloud, and third, Philanthropy Cloud, which is a bit different because with Philanthropy Cloud, we're actually serving corporations and helping them track their volunteerism, their givings, etc. So we have a number of different tech products that are coming out of .org that are driving social innovation that enable us to serve these markets better. And in addition to that, we provide pro bono support up to a certain point to help these organizations get up and running with their technology and to help them scale and solve really tough problems with their technology. I'd also love to mention Impact Labs, which is really bringing players together who are working on the same topic or issue, and them working together to figure out how can we better use technology to solve this challenge. So these are just some examples of how Salesforce is bringing its full platform to bear on these social challenges.
Absolutely. I think those are some of the great resources that you just shared. Thanks a lot, Samira. So now my next question is, what is the advice that you have got very early on in your career that kind of also shaped with whatever the work that you have been so passionately doing for all these years?
Yeah, advice that I got early in my career. I think there were a lot of people that were encouraging me to try different things and not be scared of trying different things. This goes back to my diverse experience. So, every step of the way, when I was evaluating options and opportunities, I had a lot of encouragement to just go for it, even if that kind of interrupted some of the continuity. For example, when I was at Accenture working in the public service strategy practice, I had this opportunity to work for a former professor of mine in Abu Dhabi. I had never set foot in Abu Dhabi in my entire life. The work was with the government, it was around sort of economics and security strategy. And it was a completely new environment. And I literally just made the decision and just moved there without having seen the place. I moved to Bangladesh for a year plus without having seen the place. You know, I worked in Jordan for a couple months without having seen the place. And so that just energy and spirit to adventure and to try, I think is really important to figure out where you'd like to focus. At least for me, it was. There's different personalities out there. And I think it contributes significantly to my worldview today. With that said, I do think there's a time to focus and go deeper and more narrow. And I think this is probably the right time for me to sort of build that as well.
That's great that like you had those opportunities to actually see a lot of those things, and in fact you took those opportunities without even having to really see through, and then you took those opportunities and went there, and you had the chance to really see the work that people are doing and see how you would be able to support some of these organizations. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
you said it much better than I did, but exactly.
So now, what is your advice to a lot of entrepreneurs who are listening, who wanted to become social entrepreneurs from all around the world? So, what is the best advice that you wanted to share with all of them?
Yeah, I think it's really around this community listening and iteration piece. I think whatever idea you have, I know you might be really passionate about it. It might work in concept, in theory, to an extent, but test it. Test it with the market early. Don't hold back. Start asking people what they think. Go build relationships with nonprofits. Go build relationships with social entrepreneurs. Create a brain trust to give you advice on your idea. Create almost like a mini advisory board. Entrepreneurship is as much about sort of the creation and development process internally as it is about connecting with the world around you, whether it's to understand the insights from the ground or to understand how you can bring it to market. So having those insights early and working iteratively is very important. I found it difficult to do just given how I was as a student. So very focused on getting things right and being perfect in some ways before going to other people with my ideas. And I think that can be a roadblock if you're actually thinking about becoming an entrepreneur.
Absolutely. That's a great advice. And in fact, in my previous episode, I was talking to the founder of Manush Labs, who created this accelerator program to help serve entrepreneurs from tier 2 cities in India. And one of the things that he shared last week is people, especially a lot of times we see people at the high level trying to create these programs which might be innovative to help serve the lower layer, but a lot of times the people who are actually going through the challenges are even at a better position to be able to like really understand those core problems that they wanted to solve for themselves and even for people around them. Do you also think like working closely with the people around them at that lower levels would help better serve the problems that a lot of people even at the high level are trying to solve?
Absolutely, because that anecdotal information and taken from many different places over time is very, very meaningful. And I think AI will enable us, hopefully, at some point, to gain better insights from the market and to be able to better map where social innovation and impact is taking place and how. So I think the tech sector has a huge role to play in mapping those innovations, better getting them funding and capital and bringing them to life. But going back to your more specific question, challenges I've faced in my life because I've researched them so thoroughly because they are personally important to me or my family or my community. I know them like the back of my hand. I know them so well, right? I know where to point people to resources, how to get stuff done in my own community. And I think a lot of it also comes down to knowing how to get stuff done, how to get people to change their behaviors and change their decision making, what will really get them. And you learn that by working with people on the ground who are then embedded in the actual ecosystem. Because I think bringing things to market really is in that sort of understanding of connections and what sort of makes the supply chain work the way it does, what makes people tick, where are they purchasing things from, etc. So a lot goes into it, but short answer is yes, definitely yes.
Mm. Thanks a lot for that, Samira. And we are seeing an uptick or the rise in women founders who are also equally taking advantage and solving these biggest problems. So, what do you think has changed in the recent past that really helping women entrepreneurs from around the world to make a difference?
Yeah. So, first, I think just the ability, it depends on which community, but ability for women in particular communities to access resources and to get the same sort of level of education, for it to be acceptable for them to participate in the labor force in the exact same way as men do. So there's that cultural change. But more recently, what I think are levers of change include women who are actually becoming investors because they are making decisions differently about who to invest in. I think they are bringing a different perspective to the VC and investment landscape. So having more women as investors is in fact very helpful. And then another thing is this whole idea of representation and role modeling. Basically, entrepreneurs being able to connect with other female entrepreneurs is extremely helpful, and being able to learn from them and understanding where they hesitated so that they are aware and can actively work on where they might hesitate, where they might falter when they're sort of pitching or doing sort of something in the general entrepreneurship realm. So there are resources and learning resources and mentorship groups as well as portfolios that are dedicated to women. I think that's really helpful. However, I think for true change to take place, we need this sort of he for she model where there are more men who believe in women as entrepreneurs and who are willing to give them a chance and also willing to mentor them and sponsor them in a very unique way. I think we need more of that.
I think that's a great advice that I just learned from you just by answering that question, Samira. You talked about like men even believing in a lot of women who can make a difference, and I think we have seen a rise in so many wonderful entrepreneurs who are helping a lot of women entrepreneurs, and this is just the beginning. And we are going to see more and more entrepreneurs who needed help are getting access to the right kind of tools in order to leverage and solve some of the problems in their own sector or their own communities that they truly are passionate about. So now my last question to you is, what is your biggest dream? Now that you talked about a lot of challenges that we have seen in the society, and you're super passionate about solving many of these challenges. So what is your biggest dream that you wanted to share with us today?
Yeah, I really, really believe in the individual change maker. And I've met some incredible people, incredible women on various trips around the world. I lived in Malaysia for a year, lived in India and worked there, Hong Kong, etc. They are doing incredible work in their communities. They have created businesses. They are so vibrant. They are so passionate. I want to find a way to lift their stories using technology. And I want to find a way to get them access to the same kind of capital that you see in the Silicon Valley and the same kind of resources. Because I feel if they had better access to those resources, they would be able to, if they choose to, go so much further. So I think it starts with just elevating their work and elevating their stories and making it known to entrepreneurs and investors and women and etc. in the Silicon Valley or in different powerhouses all over the world, Singapore, etc., what have you. So I want to have that kind of global conversation. So it's not just focused on C-suite female leaders who have made it. It's not just focused on people in the highest levels of government. It's not just focused on entrepreneurs who've had a certain IPO or a certain level of success in entrepreneurship. It's also focused on potential and the potential of the individual and the beautiful stories that are uncovered in cracking the way that people are having change on the ground. So that's one piece of it. And the second is I've always wanted to write a novel. The sort of thematic elements of it include actually storytelling. So there's that connection between my impact work and the novel I'd like to write. In addition to that, there's a sense of magic realism and a sense of possibility and a sense of sort of inanimate objects having life and how do you bring them to life and the challenges we face when we're silenced. So there's a greater conversation around voice in general and human voice that I want to lift through my fiction as well.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. So, how can people reach out to you and learn more about your work, Samira? Where can they find you and reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. They can reach out to me, and LinkedIn is one great way to do so. So I believe at Samira A. Khan on LinkedIn. If you look me up on LinkedIn, feel free to add me. Another great way, I use all sorts of social media, Clubhouse more recently, Twitter, Instagram. So yeah, I mean, people can reach out to me in any way. I want to connect more with people. That's what I've emphasized the whole time. So that's certainly my door is open.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for again sharing how people can reach out to you. Anything else that you wanted to finally add to our audience today?
Nothing from my end, but I was completely blown away when I got on this podcast with you and I discovered that you are an entrepreneur and you are also going to school at the same time and you are also working at the same time. So, just like maybe a nugget from you on what is the secret to being able to manage all of this in addition to the podcast, etc. I think I could benefit from that secret.
Absolutely. I think thanks for asking me that question. None of my previous guests asked that kind of a question. So, I was just reflecting back on the challenges that I went through in my own life, Samira. And as I mentioned to you before, especially coming from India, I have seen like many challenges that ordinary people go through, and just bringing up myself and my career over there, and just coming here to the US after having that initial career stint back in India have really exposed me to a lot of different areas that I'm super passionate about. So, one of the things that I'm super passionate about is education. So, that's one of the things that I wanted to solve for many people, especially in the underserved, because especially even coming to US helped me to get exposure that a lot of sectors, especially in the people of color, underserved communities, how they are going through a lot of challenges. And sometimes we have seen very less percentage of even students
Mhm.
successfully graduating from college, and once they graduate it's even difficult for them to get into workforce. So there are a lot of challenges that I have come across in this space, which I felt is one of my things to be able to make a little bit of change or a little bit of movement from whatever the knowledge or the background that I have. So that's when I started working on these different areas that I'm super passionate about, which actually helped me to learn more about myself over the past 3 or 4 years. Just talking with more people or experts like you in the social innovation have really opened me up to be able to get exposure to a lot of these experts, people who are working on the similar challenges that I'm super passionate about solving. So that's what makes me or moves me every single day. So every day once I get up, I think about a lot of great people that I'm going to meet every day to learn more about them. That's what pushes me, and that's what I thought of sharing for the question. So
Very cool, Venki. Thank you so much for sharing. So it's been wonderful meeting you as a change maker. So I would love to keep in touch and follow your journey as well. And thank you so much for having me on this.
absolutely, thank you so much for coming on to the show and sharing your journey with all of us today, Samira.
Thank you.